Okay, so I think we're live now, Eunan. My name is Síobhra Aiken, and I'm joining you here from Belfast this afternoon. And I'm very happy to be chairing this panel with Professor Eunan Halpenny from Trinity College Dublin. So what I'll do first of all is I'll briefly introduce Eunan. We very much look forward to Eunan's paper today, and then we'll have a discussion session after that. So for any of you who aren't familiar with Eunan's work, Eunan Halpenny is Professor of Contemporary Irish History at Trinity College Dublin, and he teaches and carries out research on 20th century Irish and British history, and also, as we were discussing beforehand, has a strong interest in the history of Afghanistan, so maybe that's something we can come back to. His key publications include Defending Ireland, the Irish State and its Enemies since 1922, and that was published by Oxford University Press in 1999, and also another publication with Oxford University Press, and that is Spying on Ireland, British Intelligence and Irish Neutrality during the Second World War. Last year alone, Eunan published two very successful and well-received books. The first was a biography of Kevin Barry, and the second was a study called The Dead of the Irish Revolution, which was published by Yale University Press. And I think if any of you have come across that book, you'll really appreciate the amount of research involved. And it's a study of all of the fatalities that occurred during the Irish Revolution between 1916 and 1921. And I've just heard from Eunan that he's currently working on the second volume of The Dead of the Irish Revolution, which I'm sure will be a very, very welcome contribution to the scholarship on the Civil War. And he's also interested in expanding knowledge on the Civil War by carrying out a study of an all-Ireland study of the Civil War from 1922 to 1924. So without further ado, I'll pass this over to Eunan. And Eunan's paper today is entitled Farewell to County Down. And we'll pass it over to Eunan now.
Okay, thanks very much, Síobhra, for agreeing to chair this. It's rather odd speaking to myself. I do it all the time, and people generally look at me in the street. But I should avert my eyes from my image here. I'm very grateful to Louth County Council for inviting me to do this, and also to Dr. Tom Tormey, who's their historical expert at the moment, who was a student at Trinity. He has left Trinity, as indeed I have now. I retired last September, although it was hard to tell because of COVID and all that. But I'm still working away. I think that I should also mention that Louth is in some ways in a minority, sadly, of county councils. It takes aspect. It has quite a good oral history archive. I stumbled into it about 10 years ago. I hope that it has developed since, but it certainly was an admirable initiative, and included interviews with people with recollections of those troubled times and of other times as well. And I think one of the problems with this decade of commemoration centenary we're in at the moment is that there's enormous emphasis on the military, on the male, and on violence and so on. And we don't pay nearly enough attention to how people went about their lives in a largely very rural environment like Ireland, how they got by, how they survived, how they kept themselves very often amused or whatever, what were their cultural interests and so on. So I think in some ways there's an undue focus almost on the violent side of political history, and perhaps an undue focus on politics generally as well. I mean, I'm a political historian, so I shouldn't say that. But I think one of the encouraging things about developments, even important archival developments, especially in Dublin, the military service pensions records, which are just extraordinary, is that they're not only extraordinary, I'll be referring to them in relation to my grandfather, Hugh Halpenny, but they're also extraordinary in terms of what they tell us about how people lived and how people tried to get by, and the extraordinarily difficult circumstances very often in which these are families of activists, found themselves after the revolution or after the breadwinner died or whatever. And in some ways they're a catalogue of very often of varieties of social deprivation, particularly the dependence files, rather than simply of kind of valorization of people who fought for Ireland or anything on the sort of military side. And I'd encourage anybody interested in their family's history who have a connection with the revolution, not necessarily because those records and the Bureau of Military History records, they tell us a lot, not only about the subjects of the files, but sometimes that's where you might find out where your police great-grandfather who killed him, for example. You know, I had through the Halpenys and the Halpens, my grandfather, who I'd be talking about, Hugh Halpenny, was of course an IRA officer. He ended up a Garda sergeant. His father had been an RIC constable, retired in 1907, I think. Two of his uncles were RIC men, and some of their children were in the RIC, and even, I think, remained. It remained a family tradition in the north. Some of his relatives, that's to say, my father's probably second cousins, would have remained and would have gone on into policing in the RUC. So it's not only, I think the explosion in records relating to the Irish Revolution, although they're entitled military and they're fantastically well presented, particularly by the new Military Archives organisation, the new building and so on, with so much on the web as well. But they tell us quite a lot about Irish society more generally, rather than simply the military. And I'd urge you to think of them in those terms. Okay, could we have the first slide, please? There, Barry is doing the magic, I hope, with PowerPoint. Okay, I'll take it. Yeah, now we'll click on to the next one, please. Just to mention the two works that Síobhra mentioned, in some ways to get it out of the way. I published two books last year, one of which is, if you like, a very dispassionate study, an attempt at a forensic study of deaths arising from political violence between April 1916 and December 1921. And although it's called The Dead of the Irish Revolution, I actually wanted the years to be in 1916 to 1921. But the publisher said no, and because I've been, for many reasons, I obeyed the publishers. I said, okay. But in fact, the reality is, of course, killing didn't stop on the 31st, and dying didn't stop on the 31st of December 1921. People who had been wounded, civilians, soldiers, police, IRA, some of them die in 22 or 23, and violence doesn't stop with the truce, and it doesn't stop with the treaty. I think one of the difficulties, again, with our current approach to the decade of commemorations, in some ways it's unavoidable. You would think that between the signing of the treaty and the 28th of June 1922, that not a dog barked. Now, all right, we know there's trouble in Belfast, we know there's some border troubles and so on in the new or emerging border, but we think the default position is that things were quiet, and they were far from quiet. There were people preparing, and not only pro and anti-treatyites, but the new northern state, which had acquired its own, if you like, very definitely partisan paramilitary organization, but not quite paramilitary, but its own local gendarmerie through the special constabulary. Everyone was gearing up for more trouble, and there was a lot of unofficial and local violence and some killing as well. And what I want to capture, and that's why I hope that people who are listening to this may be able to contribute to my knowledge of political violence and political fatalities in the era from January 1922 on, especially because I assume I'm talking to an audience largely from County Louth, but also from County Down, in if you like, the eastern side, northeastern side of the country, and not only in Belfast, which in some ways is the most thoroughly examined and the most violent place, but there's a lot of violence elsewhere. Of course, Síobhra would know, would obviously, because her grandfather's organization, if you like, was associated with one of the most notorious single episodes in border violence, that's to say, Altnavay. But a lot of commentary about Altnavay, and this is where the military history record, Bureau of Military History, and especially the pensions help, it takes it in isolation rather than seeing it as part of a cycle of violence, which it was on both sides of the border. And the other point I just say generally about the border, I find it hard to give a talk without being able to see people, but it is that the border, as we know it now, was not the border then. Nobody was sure that it was going to remain in the form in which it was established under the Government of Ireland Act 1920, and it was a very fluid thing, and families and communities did as they still do, just as indeed in Afghanistan, which I think Síobhra mentioned. I'm also interested in the 1930s and 40s. The border was a what you might call a fiscal border. In some ways, it became one, but it was never some vast concrete barrier, even at the height of the Troubles. And I went up to the north quite a lot in the 70s, because my granny, Annie Rice, whom I don't want to forget in this talk, from Drummondess in County Down, lived in Letterkenny for much of her adult life. And so can we just click on to the next book? One more, please. Thanks. I also published last year a book about Kevin Barry. Now, the reason this is important is not because I want to talk about Kevin Barry tonight. I don't, but because it illustrates in some ways the problem of memory in families and communities. Because all I ever heard as a kid in relation to the War of Independence and so on, I heard overwhelmingly from my grandmother, Kathy Barry, a very dynamic woman who became Kathy Maloney after marriage. But all she ever talked about was her dead brother, Kevin, and the drama and the trauma around trying to save him and so on, right? She never mentioned, a couple of slides later on, but we'll just pass them as we go. She never mentioned her husband's own activities, who was on Liam Lynch's staff and so on in the Civil War, who was in the War of Independence in Tip. She never mentioned her father-in-law at all, as far as I know, who was an anti-treaty TD, but she didn't like him. And she never mentioned her dead brother-in-law, Paddy Maloney, my grandfather's brother, who was killed in May 1921 in a fight outside Tipperary town. But my grandmother wasn't interested in these because they might get in the way of focusing only on Kevin's story. And she never even spoke, or she spoke very seldom to us as kids. She only had, my mother was the only one of her children who had children. So there were four of us, and in the 60s, well, my brother was a bit too young, but my grandmother died in 69, but she just constantly talked about Kevin. She played a very important role as a link between Dev and Liam Lynch during the Civil War. She was the secretary of the Prisoners' Dependence Fund. She was really capable, but she didn't speak about any of that. She was in and out of jail, lots of things. But all she ever spoke about was Kevin. And this is a problem which all of you in your different families face, that there's always somebody who considers that he or she is the authority and the sort of curator and the holder of family memory. But the problem is the memories they hold and the memories they refer to are very often aren't the full story. Through goodwill or bad, because of fights within the family, because of whatever, you seldom get the family history from a single member, however authoritative they are and however much research they've done. That equally applies, obviously, in my family. I was amazed earlier this year to get a lot of papers from Hugh Halpenny, my grandfather, and Annie Rice, his wife's house in Glencar and Letterkenny in County Donegal, where they ended up because he was a Garda sergeant. And there was tons of material there and tons of aspects of even of my father, who was the eldest of them, of his life and his childhood that I had no idea about. What I'm saying is that if you're inquiring into your own family or into somebody you're interested in, you have to find a plurality of sources and so on. There's never somebody who knows it all. And if they do know it all, they're either deliberately or not, but that makes them less reliable rather than more. Okay, so if I can produce the photograph of my two grandparents. I have very few photographs of them, and this reflects several things. One is the way my father's life went. It took him away from Donegal to be an engineering student on a scholarship in 1943, I think, and he never really went back. And he was the eldest of 13 children, so things were hard enough at home, and we would go back to my granny's in the summer sometimes. But Granny had lots of other grandchildren, lots of other children to look after, so I never knew that much about her life, and I never reflected on it. And one theme I want to emphasize in this talk, if I do nothing else, is that in the Irish Revolution, as in all revolutions, it's not only the warriors, as it were, who suffer. It's not only the men who die for Ireland and so on. My grandmother, as a young, she was married she wasn't quite 18, she was married to her husband, Hugh Halpenny, who was 30, I think. She had to cope, first of all, with exile, because they left the north on the day they got married for fear that he would be arrested and interned. Secondly, with movement. When she was 18, she had her first child, my father, Eugene. When she was 19, she had her second child. You see the picture. When she was 21, I think she had her third, and so on. So she had baby after baby after baby, and she generally had them. She had children in Dublin, she had children in Mallinhead, way up in the top of Donegal. She had children in Carrick in South Donegal, which was a Gaeltacht. She didn't really speak Irish, but her husband, Hugh Halpenny, was a Fíor Gaeilgeoir, very passionate cultural nationalist, if you like, as well as Republican. She had children in Letterkenny. That she had to move as a young woman from one place to another without any connection, places she had no connection with, where she knew nobody, where she didn't have friends, she didn't have cousins who could help with the babies and so on. And she had at least 13 children, one of whom died in childhood, after whom I was named. And it's just amazing if you think of the weight that must have been upon her, that her husband died when she was only 38. Think of the weight, think of the work she had to do and so on. And yet my other grandmother never mentioned her, never singled her out for comment or praise. She never said, of course, her father's mother has done a lot with her children. It's amazing how she's got by and how they've all done so well. So this valorization of the male and so on, if you like, in terms of political conflict and its consequences, is something we have to get away from. Not necessarily by showing that the women actually, did specific military roles and so on. And there's a lot of that, and a lot of research to be done on that, and that's legitimate. But also by reflecting on the impact upon women of political circumstances. They say my granny left County Down. I don't know if she'd ever been out of County Down prior to her marriage. She grew up on a farm. She was the youngest of 10 Rice kids. Her father had gone to America the year she was born. So there wasn't a big pot of money. It wasn't, a very wealthy establishment. And yet, so I think her story and the story of women like her, across the island, and indeed women in Britain whose husbands came here and died, young women typically you left with families. I think we should look much more at how they coped and how they survived and how their lives panned out, rather than focusing simply on the warriors or even on the dead, as I admit I have done in that study published last year, and as I will do with colleagues in 2 or 3 years when we get a second volume out. Okay, so Annie is there. You can see her husband Hugh. The two of them are sitting down. I assume by then they were some kind of item because of the way the photograph is composed. I don't actually. Unfortunately, I don't have the original. I took that picture hanging on a wall in the old family home. I wasn't able to take it out of the glass or anything, so it's not very good. But it is atmospheric. You can see, yeah, he was a striking-looking man, and she was a striking-looking young woman. I'm also very taken with the hats. I don't wear hats myself, but boy, if there were hats like that nowadays, I probably would. Okay, can we click on, please? Yeah, I mentioned briefly, there's my grandmother, Kathy, the dominant memory holder in my family, who spoke only of Kevin. Now, I knew her as an old lady. There she is a few months before she died. Still very great presence and so on. It never occurred to me that you see her on the left, that she was once a young woman. And although because of family circumstances, I met a lot of old Republicans in my time. Both some old ladies, there's just a slew of them who were friends of my grandmothers of that family. But I met them nearly all had fur coats, leather gloves. Don't tell the animal rights activists. And they were all kind of small ladies. A lot of them smoked, but they were all genteel little things. And yet, of course, they had once been firebrands. And similarly with a lot of the old IRA men I used to go see Todd Andrews, C.S. Andrews, quite a lot. The Dublin IRA man, who was a great fan of my grandmother and my grandfather's. I interviewed Maurice Toomey, who became chief of staff of the IRA in the mid-20s for nearly 10 years. I met Peadar O'Donnell several times. I thought of IRA men, and I thought of the War of Independence as old men with hats and coats, waiting to shoot people. And of course, you forget how young most of these people were. They once were young, and they once had young interests and behaved like young people. They weren't always these elderly, very often quite dignified people in parades and so on. And that was true of the women as well as the men. And it's something I'm sure those of you who knew people involved in one way or another in political violence in the 1920s, you'd recognize, whether you agree with me or not, you'd recognize that problem, that we must realize that most of the people that some of my generation met who'd been out in those troubles or had been affected by them, women as well as men, were young, not old. Okay, can we click on, please? Yeah, and just finally to mention my great uncle Paddy, I'm only doing this not to prove my credentials, but to show that within a family, my grandmother never talked about Paddy Maloney, right? Even though he died a fighting death he was adjutant of his 4th Battalion, 3rd Tipperary Brigade. He and his OC, Sean Duffy from Monaghan, were captured, but not captured, surrounded and killed outside Tip Town. That's his monument on the centenary of his death. Okay, can we click on? There's no more of that, I promise. Just to mention again now, in terms of looking at both at political violence in County Down, where my grandfather in East Down, Hugh Halpenny, one of the subjects of this talk, was very active, and County Louth, where of course, which is hosting this event. This is a chart from the dead of the Irish Revolution. This chart 2. Chart 1, in fact, to disastrous printer's error, is not to be relied on, but chart 2, which shows fatalities by 10,000 population per head of population from 1970 to 21, is reliable. And I think in the last year, because of COVID, we've all become slightly more attuned to looking at statistics, not just as numbers, but as proportions of the population. And what's interesting about this is that the places at the top of the chart, with Tyrone at the top, are the places that, in terms of fatalities, which may not be a good measure, are the ones that are least violent. And it is a shock to me that Tyrone comes out as the least violent in terms of fatalities from 1916 to 21, given how we now think of Tyrone as a border county and the strength of republicanism and indeed of loyalism there, and so on. It's followed by Cavan, Fermanagh, but Down is there as the 4th, if you like, quietest county in Ireland, and I think there are many reasons for this. One is that it's quite a big county, so the level of the fatalities are distributed within a very big population. The second, though, there's no doubt in Down, as in other parts of Ulster, and I say 9-county Ulster rather than 6-county Ulster. This was brought home to me in the 1990s, when for the only time I went to see where my grandfather was from, Loughin Island, and it was near Downpatrick. It's a very beautiful little place where his grandfather, my great grandfather Patrick Halpin, who was from County Louth but came to County Down, I think when he was an RRC constable, is buried. But when you look at Down, an elderly neighbour of the Halpenys, who didn't know my grandfather, but he knew all about them and so on. He was kind of half cousin. He took me around, and he said there were 2 roads from here into Downpatrick, and if you were a Republican or Sinn Féiner after 1916, you took one road. If you were a member of the ancient order of Hibernians, you took another road unless you wanted to fight. In other words, in East Down as elsewhere, you had not only about a 60% Unionist population, but you also had a very big split within the nationalists, or the Catholic community, if you like, between the Irish Parliamentary Party and the ancient order of Hibernians and Sinn Féin and the Irish Volunteers, IRA. And this is a marked feature of the politics of the Irish Revolution, which is sometimes forgotten when we look at how violence played out and so on. What's also striking about this diagram is, if you look at County Louth, it is relatively quite a violent place in terms of fatalities. And again, I wouldn't have thought that at all, but because you have a small population and so on, it's actually quite. I'm just trying to count. It's in the top 10, I think. Excuse me. So there you are. Okay, can we click on? Well, this terrific photograph was taken. It's from the Gribben collection, which is held by Down Museum. And I hope to give Down Museum my grandfather, Hugh Halpenny's collection of books. He was a big reader, clearly, and he had the habit very often of putting the date, the year that he has read a book. And it's very striking if you think of literacy nowadays. We all have electric lights and so on. But Hugh Halpenny, Annie Rice, the girl he married, and Hugh Halpenny's children until 1938, and they were all ferocious readers. All the Halpenneys, of 13 children, 12 get to adulthood, of whom 11 get the equivalent of university degrees from a family which is basically absolutely impoverished after their father died. So they're all big readers and so on. But they did most of that reading, particularly the oldest, like my dad. They did it by oil lamp. You did because there was no electricity and so on. But their father Hugh was definitely a big, and that's probably where his interest in cultural nationalism is reflected. He's a fierce reader. He's also a big self-improver. He's almost like a late Victorian figure in that. I have one of the things I want to give the Down Museum. I have a notebook he kept from about 1910 to 1912, in which he was studying different types of seeds and different, and he actually would have different kinds of seeds and clippings from plants and things stuck into this notebook, and he would have elaborate notes about what kind of fertilizer and so on you would put on them, and what was the best kind of soil and all that kind of stuff. I'm not an expert on any of this, but it's very interesting that he was so methodical, and a lot of it was written as Gaeilge. He was a fierce Irish language enthusiast as well, and he brought up his children to be in an Irish-speaking environment, although his wife Annie really didn't know any Irish except she knew the prayers that the family said every night. So you have this combination, which is not untypical, because he was, as an IRA man, he was relatively old. He was born in 1891, so he was 20-something when things got serious. So he was relatively old, which is part of the reason why he became an officer, I suspect, quite quickly, or almost immediately. But I commend the Down Museum for having this fantastic collection, and they will shortly get what little pieces I have relating to Hugh Halpenny, including his War of Independence medal. Can we click on? Yeah, this is just again to explain about Hugh Halpenny. Now, I know nothing about the County Louth Halpins, from whom the Halpins, as I say, are spin-off, but there are a lot of Halpins there, so many of them probably are in some ways relatives of mine, so they can always contact me. I'd be very interested to hear. But this is from Hugh Halpenny's first military service pension application under the 1924 Act. He was by then a member, a Garda sergeant, and so he was entitled to apply. And Seamus Woods was a very important figure in the Belfast IRA, but who in fact was himself from East Down. Rights of my grandfather. Hugh Halpenny was the pioneer of the Sinn Féin and the volunteer movement in County Down, and was under the observation of the RIC since 1916. His home was raided, shot up, and looted at regular intervals during 1920, 21, 22. He was paid by DO, I think it must be divisional officer or something, up to date of joining the Civic Guard. And that's on the Military Archives website, as is his later application, which I'll talk about at the end of this talk, which I'm nearly at now, under the 1934 Act. And all his referees under the 34 Act, who of course may have been trying to help him out, they all emphasise that when he was, in particular in Ballykinler in 1921, he was very badly beaten up. And this coincides with the family story and a family belief. He died of kidney disease at the age of 52, Bright's disease, I think it's called, but that he got this from hunger striking, and B, from being beaten up, beaten in the kidneys when he was in Ballykinler for training, for organising drills and things for the Republican prisoners. Which is interesting. He didn't smoke or drink, unlike his grandson. Well, I don't smoke, like most of his children, but there you go. Can we click on, please? Yeah, I mentioned, if you see here, this is one of his books. I have about 20 of them. And he says in the top left corner, he has Eo Halpin Loughan Island, which is obviously Loughan Island. And the bottom left, he has, I think it's Mehev, 1917. So he has this habit. And we had more of his books as kids, books by Standish O'Grady. It was kind of an Anglo-Irish writer, but who wrote these terrific Adventures of Cuchulainn and books like that, The Eagle of the North and others. But unfortunately, as kids, we read them, and as being kids, they got very badly treated. Many of them fell apart, but I still have a few. So books are a big part of it, and also political pamphlets and things, many of which I have. Can we click on? Yeah, there he is, the policeman. Can we click on again? He was only 52 when he died, so geez. Yeah, there was a very valuable book, and I must also thank Marcus McCrory, because some years ago when I had given away my copy of the book to one of my uncles, he gave me a PDF of the book, but I since have got another copy. And this is it's a sort of a spirited attempt to write a general history of republicanism, but covering over a very long period in County Down from the 1790s up to the 1920s and so on. And there's some interesting material in there. Now, what's also not so much in that study, but particularly in Belfast, in the Public Record Office, there's actually quite a lot about A, East Down, and B, the Halpennies, Hugh Halpenny and his brother Willie John, during the revolutionary era in terms of prosecution, in 23, when Hugh is a spokesman for Northerners in the South, but who don't want to be part of the Civil War and want to come back to the North. And he and a man called Louis McGuire, I think is his name, were selected by a convention in Dublin to meet Colonel Spender, the Northern Ireland Cabinet Secretary. To ask to meet him to see if they could find a way of being allowed to come back without having to, on a personal guarantee, but without signing anything, that they would attempt in a sense just to settle down. And the Northern authorities weren't buying this at all, as the file shows. And there, if anyone's looking for family histories in Belfast and in Proney, the Public Record Office, I particularly look at the internees files, because there are hundreds and hundreds of files of people interned between 22 and 24, including, as you'll see, my great uncle Dan Rice. And those files are meticulously kept. And one of the things they did systematically was prisoners could send out letters. They could smuggle out letters as well, but they were only supposed to send them out on brown postcards so that their contents could be scanned and checked. And equally, incoming letters were opened and read by the authorities. And they took out and put in individual files anything of any relevance that they thought might be faintly political. And so, for example, in my great uncle Dan Rice's file, there's a note, there's an extract from a letter from my grandmother in Dublin, who just had her first baby, and she says, "I hear you were going barefoot. I hope it wasn't for punishment." So the little things like that. So you get a lot of family stuff in the thing. And thanks, I should have asked that. Yeah, here's one of those cards from December 24 from Dan Rice. And this makes a point. One of the key points in this paper, which I won't be able to develop, is the hazards for Republicans who having come south, went north again, were huge. Dan Rice came down to be prepared for the Northern Offensive, like about 600 other IRA officers in the spring of 22. He didn't take part in the Civil War. He went back up north in December 22 and said, "I'm back here, I'm back here to farm, and that's it." And he's promptly interned. He's, quote, one of the most dangerous men in County Down, according to his RUC file. He's interned. He doesn't know for how long. He eventually gets out just before Christmas, 1924. And this is a card to my grandmother. And you'll see, if you look at the second line, he says, "Thank your most welcome letter," quote, "with Pauline's photo enclosed." So Dan got a picture of my dad, Pauline, at the age of 1 and a bit, and having sent lots of pictures. If those of you who've had children would have done this. I remember sending my sister loads of pictures of my first son, Patrick, when he was about 5 or 6 months old, and she kind of jokingly said, "Okay, that's fine. I've had enough," because he was a baby after all. She had babies herself, and they aren't quite as magical and unique in photographs as they are for their parents. Anyway, it's a nice and very human letter, as so many of these ones are. Can we click on? Thanks. Yeah, this is an example. I don't want to read it out, and maybe too difficult for you to manage here. But if you want to find out about Hugh Halpenny's IRA career, you look at his various pension files, all of which are now online in the military archives, and this fantastic format that they have, which makes them, it really is an extraordinary breakthrough in terms of public access to records. And the records, as you probably know, are quite complicated. Individual files, or you have to get used to reading through them. You'll find shortcuts through them very often, because very often applications are maybe made by hand, but then somebody in the office, probably a woman, types them up, and so everything is much clearer. But this is a summary of some of my grandfather's activities in 1919 and 1920. And what's interesting for me is at the very bottom of the page, first of all, there's some inaccuracies here in note-taking or otherwise, but they mention that at the bottom, when he's leading a raid to burn actually the Inland Revenue Office, I think it was, in Downpatrick, a man comes out of with the bar out of the darkness and strikes him, which my grandfather says in his various files, which Tommy Brannigan, who was his number 2 in that operation, says in his pension file and elsewhere. And indeed, even the London Times describes this event, because they say it was the clergyman, the Reverend T.G. Wilkinson, who's the underdean of Downpatrick Cathedral. He's not a Presbyterian, as that document says. He was a Church of Ireland clergyman. And what's interesting about grandfather didn't, although this file says he didn't shoot him, he told Brannigan to shoot him. He said, thinking he was an RIC man. Brannigan shot him in the leg, and that was that. And I always heard as a kid, and it shows you what you hear and don't hear within the family. I always heard this was the thing my grandfather greatly regretted, the shooting of a clergyman, and secondly, that the man was wounded. And it was only through my own researches in the last few years I discovered that the man died just 2 years afterwards. And then when my grandfather's file comes out, that my grandfather explicitly says, and Brannigan explicitly say, yeah, he died because we shot him. So to have in your family, the killing of a clergyman, even accidentally, as it were, is kind of bad. I don't know whether it was deliberate or not, that it was never mentioned what happened to the poor old Wilkinson between his wound and his death 2 years later. But what's interesting is that in the pensions files, both Brannigan and my grandfather say, yeah, he died as a result of us shooting him. Now, they don't say, hooray, we got him. On the contrary, clearly they think it's unfortunate. But it shows you how what may come to you through the family isn't necessarily the whole story. Can we click on, please? Yeah, I mentioned Dan Rice, my granny's brother. He went back up in late 22, early 23 and got locked up, as it turned out, for 2 years. Then he went to America for some years because you couldn't stay in the North. Again, people within the North and who know their history will understand this. It applied not only to Republican men, but to Republican women. I've written recently about Alice Mallon or Alice McSloy from outside Cookstown, who is considered a quite important figure as an IRA helper, if you like, in and around Cookstown, from a very Republican family, who's eventually interned. After internment, she's let out and she goes to Dublin to work, but she comes back to the North to mind her elderly father. And then she's locked up again, and then she's served with an exclusion order, which means that she can stay at home minding her father, but she can't go into Cookstown, where she'd had a good job as a typist, which for in those days, for a woman to have the skills of a typist meant you had an office job, meant you had a bit of money, it meant you were able to move out of the house and so on. Whereas because the Northern Authority said, yes, you can stay and mind your father, but you can't go within 5 miles of the one place where her skills could be used. And I think those kind of dimensions of the consequences of activism, particularly in this jurisdiction, really are forgotten. And it partly explains why so many Northerners who came south, and after all, it was by and large the real activists who left the North to prepare, as Dan Rice did, for the Northern campaign that never happened. Why so many of them stayed south. People like Dan McKenna, who became standing chief of staff of the army during the Second World War, the emergency, if you prefer. People like Johnny Hoy, who gave us Charlie, There's a very important biography of Charlie coming out in about 4 weeks by my former student, Professor Gary Murphy. And people like Dan Rice, who did go back, and when he went back, says he got locked up indefinitely, in fact, for 2 years. And what consequence did that have for his relationships, for his family, for the farm? It's almost unimaginable. And that's why I think so many Republicans who left, including my grandfather, didn't go back, because they didn't know for how long the northern state would lock them up if they did. And they didn't know, perhaps mercifully, what life was going to be like in the north thereafter. It's interesting, Dan Rice, who moved towards a kind of the predecessor of the SDLP, and in 1965 he ran for Stormont, but of course didn't get in against Brian Faulkner, who became, of course, quite a modernizing figure in unionism and died, unfortunately, rather young in 1976. Obviously, Faulkner beat him pretty easily, I think, by about 5,000 votes. But still, it was interesting that he made the transition, if you like, from armed force republicanism to what I'd say we would regard as an SDLP position, and held that until his death. And he got a hall named after him, which is probably reflects also his standing not only within the nationalists, but eventually at local level within the unionist community, which is interesting in itself. And I think it also tells us something about the Rice family and about his sister Annie, as I say, who at the age of 38 is widowed with 13 children. Can we click on? Thanks. Yeah, here's my granny on the left with her her two youngest children are either side of her. My namesake Eunan, who died at the age of 12, he had a tumor on his spine, a benign tumor, but in the end it killed him. My Aunt Mary, her youngest child, and Mary was born about 2 weeks before her father died. But the more I look at this, the more it amazes me that a woman like my grandmother, how she could cope with almost no money, with, as I say, with 13 children, and having one child after another, in one place after another, without the web of connections and friendships and family that normally were the kind of consolation of young women with big families. She drove them all on. Two of her sons, you can see there, were priests. Father Colin, who died in 2003 in the Philippines. Father A, who's still alive and good form at the age of 84. The O'Halpins, when they came to Letterkenny, for whatever reason, partly because Hugh Halpenny was such a Gaeilgeoir enthusiast, he became very much involved in the sort of cultural life of the Irish language activities in Donegal generally. But the boys were very good at sport. The girls were pretty good too. One of the ironies, though, of the way local newspapers work is that there's very little about the girls that you can find publicly. There are 5 girls, all very accomplished in their way, but they won prizes for piano, for dancing, for debating, and so on. But it's the boys who turn up all the time, because most of them are really good footballers. That Colin played for Donegal for some years. So did Con, his brother. Joseph, who's the boy with the smiling boy beside his older sister, played for Ulster colleges and so on. Then he decided to try to become a professional footballer. He played for Bows in Dublin and then went to Spurs, but he got injured and became a nurse instead. So there's a big sport, and sport gets you. It gets you attention and gets you mentions a lot in local papers. Anthony, who's also in the photograph, was also a good sportsman. They all were. But that's all in Letterkenny. It's not in County Down. But it's all due to their dad's dead. It's due to their mother. Can we click on? And just a dimension from the records of the treaty and the impact of the treaty. On the left, we have a card from Tommy Brannigan, who's interned in County Down, who had been Hugh Halpenny's number 2 when Hugh was a battalion commander in East Down. And what Brannigan says in this card, it's hard to read, but he says, "You've changed your mind about the treaty." Now he doesn't call them names as other people do, whom he had served with. but he says it's a pity, but he says we should always retain our friendship, which is a very in terms of the treaty, a very nice way of dealing with it and so on. He ends with best wishes to you both, meaning to my grandmother, whom he knew, of course, as well as to Hugh. So he doesn't want to be bitter, even though he's interned in the north, and Hugh is now down in the south, and through Seamus Woods has become a Garda sergeant. And the nice thing is when I got Brannigan's pension file, which was released some time ago, there's a very long reference from my grandfather for Brannigan. And sometimes because of personal clashes, or because of bitterness, or because of the treaty split, people didn't write good references, because somebody who'd been your commanding officer had to write a reference for you. And sometimes there was a suspicion that people would do each other down and so on. But Hugh Halpenny, who unlike me has legible handwriting, writes, says Brannigan was an outstanding officer and so on and so on. In fact, Brannigan became a battalion OC himself. So it's interesting that in the case of these two Northerners who take different positions on the treaty, and this is also reflected if you look in our map, where there are thousands of these internees postcards in different collections. Sometimes the treaty becomes, differences on the treaty become an absolute split between former comrades, and sometimes they say, look, that's politics, but we still respect each other. And just a final point about Hugh Halpenny in terms of these kind of contacts. When he was released from jail, his first time in jail in 1919, I think it was in Downpatrick when he came back from Dublin, or perhaps from Belfast. But there was a big Sinn Féin sort of group to meet him, and there was a riot in which three policemen were quite seriously injured, one of whom was a Constable Wilkie, who got £300, which is, about well over twice his yearly wage compensation. And Wilkie was from outside Letterkenny, from Churchill, and my grandfather and Wilkie used to go walking in the evenings. Once he came to Letterkenny and they met up, which is kind of a nice reconciliation story. And it was a story I was always told as a kid, that, well, in some ways to reinforce the idea that reconciliation was a better approach than enduring hostility. Can we click on, please? There's I won't go into this. There's my grandfather's rather disappointing outcome of the Military Service Pensions Act 1934. Now, the point about this was this document is that his pension was determined about 3 days before he died. And can we click on? Yeah, and I'll just stop here. And what happens in the file is that my grandmother writes on the 4th of May, 1943, as follows. My husband, for whom a military service certificate came today, died on Easter Monday, April 26th. I have signed enclosed form and trust that it will be all right. I trust you will be as generous towards family as possible, as he had left a family of 13 children behind him, none of whom are earning anything. The youngest was born 3 weeks before his death, and she goes on. And I think it's very interesting. It's a very moving letter. It also shows that, which was clearly reflected in her life, her own capacity and abilities, which probably could have brought her somewhere else had she not had so many children and so on. And it's an interesting contrast, because I'll end with this, or near this, our chairperson, is Síobhra Aiken. When my Dublin grandmother, Kevin Barry's sister, who didn't recognize the Free State, who refused to speak to De Valera, once De Valera founded Fianna Fáil, she was an out-and-out Republican. But when she wanted to get her husband's pension in 1935, she goes to see Frank Aiken, the Minister for Defence, and she says, because it's on the file, she says, Mrs. Maloney has been to see the minister, and he directs that her husband, Jim Maloney, and her brother, Michael Barry's pensions applications be dealt with forthwith. And it shows you the difference in access between my two grandmothers, both of whom admirable dynamic figures in their own way, but one of whom, it seems to me, perhaps it's true of County Down women generally, was in her own way a heroic figure, but yet a very, entirely within the family sphere, whereas my grandmother was much more prominent particularly in the Civil War, but also in the business of making sure her brother, Kevin, was endlessly commemorated. Can we click on, please? Yeah, there's my grandfather's Black and Tan medal, as it's known, Warvid Penna's medal, which I'm going to give to the Down Museum shortly. And are we at the end now? Okay, well, I'll just, before you come in, Chief, to kind of summarize, I think we in this jurisdiction, put it that way, as historians, as well as citizens, we really don't have much feeling for what Northern Republicans went through, not just in terms of violence, which is very much associated with Belfast, so there's a lot of violence in other counties too, but also the if you like, the enduring oppression that they suffered after 1922, not necessarily directly, but nationalists as well as Republicans, they were suspect to the state in a structural way. And it was, I think, part of the failure in this jurisdiction to grasp at a human level the difficulties for nationalists, for Catholics, would be in some way you just say, of living in the New North, not simply in terms of overt oppression, but just in terms of being second-class citizens, and the impact upon people who had no interest in the armed struggle, no taste for violence. But nevertheless, I do think we in this jurisdiction underestimated that the environment in which the minority found themselves in the new Northern Ireland after 1922. Now we can argue and discuss the position of the minority in this jurisdiction, which is not a mirror image, but certainly you will find that many people who would argue that non-Catholics in the New Ireland felt they were discriminated against. They felt they were in some ways not exactly oppressed, but certainly almost suspect and so on. But that's sort of a different debate. So I'll just end, I've probably spoken too long, by saying that I hope we use this fantastic cornucopia of material that's there, primarily focused on military service and its consequences, that I hope we'll start using it not simply to see how many ambushes somebody was in, or to find out who shot your grandfather, or that kind of thing, which is interesting and sometimes traumatic, but to look at the wider society and the lives and the circumstances of people reflected in these records, which as you know, which speak for families as much as they speak for the person who got the medal, or the IRA fella, probably no more than 20, who was killed, or the RIC man perhaps in his 50s about to retire, who's shot dead as he steps out of his door. So the wider we look, and the wider we look at other across communities and so on, but use these apparently explicitly military records to do it, the better. Okay, I'm finished. I haven't really started, but I'm finished. Thank you. Síobhra.
Thanks so much, Eunan. I'm just getting my mic working there. I think I should be back on now. Thanks so much for a fascinating paper. I've been taking notes here, and I think there's so many directions that we could go. What I'll probably do is I might ask a few questions, Eunan, and then if anyone from the audience wants to ask a question, and I see Kieran Glenn had his question there that we'll come back to in a minute. I was really struck by a number of things, I think, in that presentation. Eunan, it certainly wasn't a political history, but I do think that the character of your grandmother, Annie Rice, really stands out. 13 children, but also the fact that they went on to have such educational opportunities, that really is a testament, I suppose, to her herself as well. So that's really fascinating. You mentioned my great-grandfather, Frank Aiken.
Great-grandfather.
And I actually have another family story for you.
Are you?
In terms of Kevin Barry, because I think what you said is quite interesting, that contrast there between your two grandmothers, Annie Rice, and then of course we've heard of Kathy Barry Maloney, in terms of the status and access, and that's something that's very striking in my own family as well, that the Aiken family side is quite distinct from the other family side, and my great granny on the other side, as it happens, was from Fleet Street in Dublin, and one of her favourite memories is as a child having known Kevin Barry, and it was, as you said, something that maybe dominated her family stories more so than other aspects of the family stories. And there's a lovely Irish Press article, I think actually from 1993, when the Temple Bar Hotel was opened on Fleet Street, that she was invited as a guest of honour as a local resident. And her whole article is about Kevin Barry and how she remembered Kevin Barry, which is quite interesting. But I think that brings up questions of memory then in history, doesn't it? What's retained in family memory, maybe what's forgotten as well. And I know that's what Guy Biner has been asking us to think about more and more in terms of how we compose history. So I suppose that's my first question to you as a historian who has been working for so long in this area. How do we reconcile, I suppose, the history that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, for example, our records and looking at ancient files and particularly political evidence? How do we reconcile that with memory and particularly family memory? And is there any scholars that you've looked to, any scholarship that you've looked to who you think have been successful, I suppose, in bringing these two elements together?
I can't answer that question really. It's become so for me kind of so personal, right? I mean, I wanted to write my book on Afghanistan towards the end of my, I just retired, but I was going the last couple of years, I was going to do the Afghan book, and then the bloody Centenaries happened. I mean, I'm still very driven by archives and so on, partly because I grew up with all this Kevin Barry stuff in the background and meeting all these old Republicans and all that kind of stuff, though not being schooled into sort of Republicanism in contemporary sense at all. And it's only in my own reflections. I haven't really looked much at what other historians. I'm familiar with Guy's work and with other people who have tried. Alan Thompson, an obvious one, who tried to look at the I won't say the contest, the tension between family narrative and personal narrative and what the records appear to suggest and so on. And I don't have an answer. In fact, looking back at my career, I'm a really bad, amongst other things, a really bad oral historian. I did my PhD in a man called Sir Warren Fisher, who was head of the British Treasury from 1919 to 1939, and a pronounced advocate of Irish independence and so on. And yet, looking back, I did a lot of oral history. I didn't think of it as, I went to see a lot of Sir Humphreys, as it were, a lot of retired Whitehall chiefs who had been young men, almost all young men in the 1930s and 40s, and who knew of Fisher and knew stories about him and so on. So in that way, I got a lot of Treasury folklore, what I would call a Whitehall folklore, which I just took for granted, even though it wasn't in the record, but I didn't realize I was doing oral history, right? But clearly I was. I just hadn't thought about it. I hadn't thought about the ethics of it. I hadn't thought about the procedures. I was just going and chatting to people and then corresponding with them, which was incredibly helpful, because they, being civil servants or ex-civil servants, would always reply to a draft in writing. So I've loads of letters, which are probably better than my illegible notes. So I didn't think about it systematically the way that a younger generation of historians and social scientists do and have to do. On the family side, I'm just continually amazed, both at what you're told, and even in terms of my grandmother. Last week, I was in a relative's house I've arranged for her to give a lot of papers relating to her late father-in-law, was what I call Jim Donovan, the mastermind behind the S Plan, a very important anti-treatyite and IRA figure to the 1940s, and big link with the Germans and so on. And I was looking at a German language edition of Spies in Ireland, which was written by a German journalist with his help. And I opened it, and in the middle I found a letter, because the letter was from Connie Neenan, who's a well-known Cork IRA man, to Jim O'Donovan in 1969, and saying, "I'm very sorry to hear that Kitty has died." And he goes on to, "I knew her during the Civil War when she was down here. I was in the 1st Southern Division." And he went on to say, "And of course she had the terrible job," I'm paraphrasing it, "when Liam Lynch was killed, it was she who was told to go and tell his mother." Now my grandmother, who talked, she never said that. Now, was that because that was so painful for her, because it was echoes of Kevin's death? Or was it because it just wasn't important enough, or might get in the way of the Kevin story? So here's my grandmother, who, as I say, relatively talked all the time about aspects of her own, particularly of Kevin, and yet she never mentioned this dramatic moment. She does in Florence O'Donoghue's book, No Other Law. He interviewed her, and she was one of the last people to talk to Lynch, because she was brought down Dev's ideas, and she and Lynch have a long discussion. But but she never said to obviously to O'Donoghue, or else he didn't write it. Oh, by the way, I had the terrible job of saying to Mrs. Lynch, look, I'm very sorry, but Liam's been killed. So what people know, remember, and will tell you is highly selective and variable, and it depends not only. Can I give one more example with Annie Rice? I only learned this from her youngest daughter, Mary, born just 2 weeks after Dad died, or before Dad died. But when I asked Granny about what it was like as a young girl of 14, 15, 16, living in County Down, the house constantly raided. And your house is being raided not just by the military or even the regular police, but it's also by specials, right? And these specials are young fellas from around the area who know you, right? And when I asked her about this, she told me kind of jokingly about a song about a terrible girl called Dora. I'm sure some of the people here know the song, who comes into your house. Defence of the Realm Act is the acronym. It's an acronym for the Defence of the Realm. It comes into your house, tears the place up, breaks all the plates, bursts all the bags of flour, and so on and so on, right? But what did she tell her daughter about? So she made a joke of it to me, these constant raids. She told her daughter, well, what it was like as a 14 or 15 or 16-year-old girl at night with all the men gone because they were the target. You're there on your own or with the other women, and you're out there being forced out of the house at night by young men with guns, some of whom know you. A lot of them aren't professionals, they're just local farmers, but of the other persuasion. So she's talking about sexual menace. Now, Granny was a devout Catholic, was what kept her going. She wasn't going to start talking to me saying, Jesus, I was afraid what might happen. So what I'm saying is the same person may have a portfolio of memories and emotions, but he or she isn't necessarily going to open up to any one person about all of them. Sorry.
Absolutely, yeah, no, thanks for that. And there's so much, I think, to be explored, isn't there, in terms of what's censored maybe by other family members or by society, but then also that sense of self-censorship as well, that there's always a need to conceal or a want to conceal certain elements. So it really is fascinating how certain, as I think you said, there's a curation of memory in that case around Kevin Barry, that certain memories are foregrounded over the others. And I suppose it's our challenge, isn't it, as historians, to unpack that, what's been remembered and what's been forgotten.
I think, though, there's also, I think there is I might get into terrible trouble here. I think there's a gender dimension. I do think, for example, some of my cousins on the Halpenny side, they have much more interesting stories about the O'Halpens growing up than I did. Because I heard about football a bit and this and that, and my dad's was a very successful business and all that stuff. But they heard other stuff because they heard it from their mothers. Do you see what I mean? Right, and so they, I don't know. I'm just digging a big hole which I'm going to fall into, full of spikes of one sort or another. But I do think women read the world differently and pick up things which we men are too dumb to be aware of, and not just because people don't say them to us, but we don't say, well, why aren't we talking about this or that? Whereas I think women are much more perceptive in terms of, I won't say the world of emotions exactly, but No,
that's interesting. It's actually something that's come up in my own research, but maybe from another element in terms of the family side, that a lot of the, I suppose, family stories, I've been working on the Civil War for the last number of years, and unintentionally coming across family history as I'm trailing through the archives, even though that's not what I was setting out to do. But one of the things that I have discovered is that it's the women's militant roles that weren't passed down in my family in any case, and that I actually discovered 3 cases of women revolutionaries in the family who I didn't know about, that their stories weren't passed down, that weren't integrated into family history. But as you said, maybe that was, the women might have had their own memories that they were passed down, but in that case, there's a very strong gendered element, that the militant roles and the active roles were associated with the male figures, particularly in my case with Frank Aiken, and that might have overshadowed perhaps. So it is really quite interesting.
And think of, I think I wrote it somewhere. It's in November 1922. His alleged informer, I'll think of his name in a minute, it might be Giles, right? He leaves 10 children, right? And what happened to his wife? I think her name was Elizabeth. and those kids? How did they survive? How did they get on? It's not only the, as it were, the protagonists to look at. It's also just wider society, and probably as the family Hunt was the name of an alleged informer, because a lot of these people, before he said a movable feast at the best of times, an allegation of spying, but there would have been a taint on them as well, probably, which meant they probably weren't going to get much help. People were probably afraid to be seen to be helping them anyway, and there were 10 of them. I mean, it's just extraordinary. But history belongs. Everyone has a history, whether you're a black and tan, whether you're an orange man, whether you're just an ordinary Joe Soap who has nothing to do with anything, but whose life is severely disrupted. And we know from more scientific studies of the more recent Northern Troubles of the impact on society, not just on communal relations, but within families and so on, who aren't political, who aren't involved, but yet the stresses and so on are how people cope. I think we would do well to do more reflection on that in relation to the Irish Revolution than we do.
I could go on for ages, Eunan, but I think we better turn over to our questions. And we have a really interesting question by Kieran Glennon, because I think one of the things that you've raised, and I think we could probably discuss a lot more, is that idea of the experience of Northern Republicans. And I know you've spoken elsewhere of the forgotten Northern exodus, and I think that's probably an aspect that still hasn't been totally unpacked within the historiography. There's been more emphasis on migration in more recent years and the push towards the global Irish Revolution, but I think there's still questions to be answered. And Kieran Glennon, who many of you I'm sure know and know his work, has a question here on that, and that's the fact that there was an 8% emigration rate from the north from 22 to 38, but going by the nominal rolls, the rate for East Down Brigade was 23%, higher even than Belfast or Antrim brigades. Does Eunan have any insight into why that was so apart from political emigration? And I'd like to know myself. I actually did research on the Cumann nominal rolls, and it was something that actually came up as well, was in South Down in this case, that many of the women were no longer in the area and could not be traced in that case. So, Eunan, I don't know if you have any other insights. Is this something that we can attribute to politics?
Before I answer that, which I give a very bad answer to, can I mention that there's an additional problem with women, which is marriage and change of name. And this makes them really, with the best will of the world, makes them harder to trace through records and so on, even though records have become much more accessible and sophisticated. I don't know much about East Down. I'm a complete ignoramus. I was only driven around it the once. I was told in that short drive, I was told one shocking family story, allegation in relation to a political allegation, and I wasn't told the story which has been in the papers. I won't mention it here, from the 1950s, which Eugene McCabe wrote a play, and the man whose family were involved never mentioned to me this story. So different people tell you different things for different reasons. And so, but the particulars of East Down, no, I haven't done much work at all on Down, other than incidentally to some extent on my grandfather. But they, because my dad died at 54, and he was a forward-looking man. He was lots of interests and so on. He didn't talk about his family at all, hardly. We used to go up to Granny's, and where he was treated like a lord because he's a darling eldest son. But we never talked. We never said. I was never that. I just knew my uncles were nearly all good footballers, like me, and my aunts were nurses and teachers, and I had 2 priest uncles, and that was it. It was just you don't within your own family. You tune out a lot of the time. Maybe you have to tune out, and so you don't understand. I would not feel bad, but I regret that I didn't, because I used to go and see Granny sometimes on my own in the 1970s. She died of a heart attack in 1980. But I regret that I didn't try to have a sort of a structured discussion with her. I'm not sure what you have talked about, but I'm sure it wouldn't have been about her or about how she coped with all these, 13 kids. And the thing is, those days, babies, you were breastfeeding, I guess. So she must have been, if you think of just the life she led, and yet she appeared a happy, contented, purposeful woman. And certainly she wasn't voting for contraception or any of that stuff, So she wasn't progressive.
Yeah, well, we'll have to, I suppose, come back to Kieran Glennon another time, but 23%.
Well, sorry, no, back to Kieran. I don't really have an answer,
Yeah.
Kieran. Sorry, he's done much more work than me in this area.
Yeah, it definitely seems high. I know from what I've looked at, it's particularly high in the Western Seaboards of coming on.
Oh, it's amazing.
70%, 50%.
But I did look at one company out of curiosity some years ago when the activities files were being prepared for release, and because I advise on them, so I'm allowed to look at them in advance. And I looked at at Rosslea, the Rosslea battalion of the IRA, and if you think of what happened in Rosslea in 21, it looks more like a small version of Bosnia or whatever. What happened in terms of the first of all the burning out of Catholics, and then the retaliation and the killing of the two special constables, and wounding one guy's wife, and so on and so on. It's pretty visceral stuff. And yet, the Rosslea for the battalion is listed. Nearly all of them live in Fermanagh. In the 1930s, they haven't gone anywhere, even though they're literally, if their cows are straying, they could be straying onto the field of somebody whose death they had attempted to organise, and vice versa, because the specials were at it too. So how does communal life, or not, how does life work with so many people still in situ? Who know that person tried to do me, or that guy's father, our grandfather tried to kill my and so on and so on. It's a very difficult and complex, and obviously it's related and contemporary question. And I don't understand how it is. The Western Seaboard, it's almost a farce if you look at the lists of people, of volunteers versus where they live now, because so many of them, especially Mayo, Galway, Donegal, Kerry, they're all gone. They're all in New York or wherever. It's really striking. The East Coast, most of them are at home. I don't know about East Down.
Yeah. I'll move on, because I think there's a lot more we could say about immigration, but definitely what we're seeing with that is that it's economically as well as politically motivated, and there's probably maybe a clash of different factors, including economics. But we'll move on there, because we have a comment here from Roisin, who I think is a relation Eunan. And Roisin says, my mum, your Aunt Nuala, told me that Granny was a runner for the IRA and was carrying documents, and saw an army squad hopped onto a haystack. They came upon the haystack and pierced it with their bayonet, and she felt one grazing her leg, I think. And they moved on, and after a while she hopped out and continued on her mission. And she said, don't worry, Roisin, about the typos, but she said that she was about 15 at the time, so resilient. So I don't know if you can shed any more light on that particular story.
No, I did ask Granny once. And Granny, you see, felt obliged to reference Kevin Barry, who she obviously couldn't stand. She didn't really like my mother, because she found it difficult for anyone to marry her wonderful children, especially the boys. But she did say, I did you anything, Granny, and will you come on? She had no, really, all I did was carry messages. And even my other grandmother in her military history witness statement, which is all about Kevin Barry and trying to rescue him, she says, oh, we didn't do anything. We just smuggled guns and letters and things. And she did a lot of organizing as well, but she didn't even mention that. But it's funny how they dismissed the very hazardous. Again, as a young girl, I don't want to harp on about it, but you're going about with documents hidden on your person. This, if you're not careful, if it's a local special or something, this is going to give him a chance, to make you feel very uncomfortable. And so the hazard is there. It's not that everybody was so genteel that you'd be sure that anything wouldn't happen to you. But it's funny that she was absolutely dismissive of it, even though at her funeral there was an army firing party, a real army, that's to say, the Defence Forces army, who fired a volley. And I was such a coward. I was in a hired car driving back. I was going to be driving back to the north, that I didn't pick up. The shells were discarded, whatever, the blanks, and I didn't pick up any of the blanks. But in fact, a cousin of mine more recently gave me one of those blanks, and I'm going to give it with I've given all the family papers from Letterkenny to the Donegal County Library as the documents of a family just trying to struggle much more that is a political thing. And I have the casing to give them as well. But it shows what a coward I am. I didn't want to be caught as a young man, driving through the north with the, you can see why, with the remains of a bullet. What a coward.
That's fascinating, Eunan, and I think you've highlighted as well the importance of keeping that kind of family material and also donating it, in this case, to the local library. And I'm sure there's people here listening who might have material at home as well.
It's in the attic. I had a picture, I took it out of the slide. My cousin Roisin, her grandfather, Thomas Brennan, who's from Scottstown in Monaghan. When he was dying, he sent for Roisin's father, Pat, whom he'd never spoken to. He never spoke to the children about the War of Independence, the Civil War. And he said, Pat, there's a box, a biscuit tin, I want you to look after it. And in the biscuit tin, there are hundreds of IRA. He was a battalion adjutant and intelligence officer. Hundreds of IRA documents, right? Which he let me go through. There was also a 1911, an automatic pistol of a type manufactured initially in 1911, which definitely, thank God, it didn't work anymore. And there was a handwritten account of what his battalion, Monaghan Battalion, had done in the War of Independence. And at one point, I've used the photograph of the page somewhere. He starts describing how they discover there's an informer sending letters to the RIC saying that there's guns hidden here and there's IRA guys hiding there. And this is a local woman called Kate Carroll, who's from the next townland. They knew her, Kitty Carroll. She made poaching. Her brother was disabled. Her father was elderly. She was a poaching maker, right? Which meant she was always in trouble with the police and with the IRA, because periodically they tried to stamp out this scourge. And she drank a lot of her own product, they say, so she wasn't really, quote, she wasn't nearly normal. But she's writing these crazy letters. They warn her. He writes about all this. He says, TBIO, Thomas Brennan, Italian intelligence officer, investigates and discovers, and she's warned, and our serious notice would have to be taken of it. She's warned, she sends another letter, and then he writes, and etc. And then he leaves the rest of the page blank, and you turn over the page, and he starts again. He continues it with the battalion story. But he writes, and etc., because what do they do with Kate Carroll? They took her out up the hill, and they shot her. And it's quite likely, because battalion officers tended to be part of court martials, that was one of the guns that was involved. And he never spoke about it to his children, never spoke about any of that stuff. And yet at the end, he gave it to Pat, who had kept it in the chicken shed quite well, but chicken sheds aren't the best place for old records. And then in the end, Pat donated them to the Monaghan Museum, where they are. So most things they're much safer in a museum and an archive than they are in even the driest chicken shed, or in your attic, or pinned on your wall. And nowadays, because you can take very good scans for nothing, very good images, you can have all that pleasure. As I say, I'm giving my grandfather's thing to the Down Museum. I'm giving my grandfather Jim Maloney's medal to the Tipperary Museum, because I'm whatever age, 67, and it's no use to me, and it's of some historical interest. So yeah, get that stuff out of the shed, get it back from cousin Barney or from the neighbor who borrowed it, which has happened with another relative, a very famous relative. A lot of family stuff was lent to friends and they never gave it back. So museums and libraries, that's what you want. Local museums, local libraries are fantastic, including the Louth one, I have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of things we could continue to discuss there, Eunan, but I am conscious that we're kind of tight on time. So what I might say is, if anyone else in the audience has a question, maybe we can take a question from the audience. And just on that note, there's a comment here from Louise Evans, I think again is another family member. And she says that, I remember Dad Con saying he wished he'd pick up a shell too from Granny's funeral. Lovely to hear about her, Eunan. So I think that highlights, I suppose, the importance as well of discussing these family stories.
Yeah, Colin, her dad, Lou's dad, was who played for, I think he played in goals for Donegal, but he was a great collector of family lore relating to his parents. I have some of the material he collected, but he was very assiduous. He died last year. He was 90, I think. There's a few of them left.
Great. So do we have any other questions from the audience? I'll just check. I don't think so, though. Well, I think we can probably wrap up, Eunan, because we've gone past our hour slot. But I think if we had more time, we could probably stay here all evening with the discussions. But I just want to thank you again. I really enjoyed all of those insights, and I think the richness of the family presentation is that we do get an idea of the revolution beyond the political element and beyond the military as well. And I think it's a really valuable way of reframing our understanding of the revolution. And I think that's what we've seen in recent scholarship, particularly with the release of the pensions applications and so on. So it really complements, I think, a lot of the work that other scholars are doing at the moment as well. So any other questions before we finish, or any comments to Eunan before we end our presentation today? Maria says thank you for a wonderful presentation. Well, Eunan, unless you have anything else to add, will we wrap it up there for the evening?
No, I would just reiterate a plea to people who have records, and they don't have to be. I didn't show it, but I found the receipt from the funeral directors in 1952 for the burial of Eunan O'Halpin, age 13, my uncle after whom I'm named. Right now, in some ways you say that's of no public interest. But how many funeral bills actually make it to an archive so people can see how they're constructed? The answer is almost none. Right? What appears the ordinary and the banal and the whatever, these are just more as important as the letter De Valera signed or something, because they tell us about how ordinary people, excuse the term ordinary people, but how normal ordinary people lived and how they functioned and how they interacted with the state and so on and so on and so on. I think it's if we look at, I've been looking to the dead. One of the most wonderful new developments in this jurisdiction, alas not in the north, is that the death registers and birth, deaths, wedding registers are now online to the General Register Office through a thing called Irish Genealogy, I think it's called. But that's fantastic, because what you do there, you go and you see, I'm looking for people who died violently, but what do I see all the time? I see people dying at any age from 5 to 50, and they're dying of TB in the 1920s. It's just it was so normal. Of course, it wasn't mentioned. It wasn't called TB. It was the disease of the poor. Rich people didn't die of it. But it's everywhere. And so looking at the death registers, you're looking for, so-and-so who was shot in the head or whatever, but up either side of him or her, nearly these enormous numbers of people dying of tuberculosis and so on. I know a lot of people have done a lot of work in UCD and elsewhere, Limerick and so on, if you like, the lives and deaths and ailments of ordinary people. But the more we do of that, the better, because the more then we'll understand where the political came from and so on, and the intersection between politics and ordinary life, I think.
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, and absolutely. I know that Guy Biner's forthcoming book is that question of the Spanish flu, and of course how that has been so forgotten amongst the military histories, I suppose, of the 20th century. So that definitely ties into that question of epidemics and TB.
Yeah.
I think we'll wrap it up there. We have a note here about the rest of the schedule. So as you all know, this is just one lecture in a series, and tomorrow's talk is actually at 2:15 p.m. on the Boundary Commission, and the link is in the chat if anyone wants to sign up for that. So I'll finish up there, and once again, if we can thank Eunan O'Halpin for a really fascinating, insightful talk. I know I'll give you a round of applause, Eunan, and I'm sure people at home will too. Okay, so thanks so much.
If this is the Soviet Union, I would clap myself anyway, for stopping. Okay, thanks very much, folks. See ya. Bye, Síobhra. Thanks for that.